Captain Maya Brooks was drinking her morning coffee when she saw something moving inside her cup, and she looked closer and froze because there was a tiny woman sitting on the edge of her mug, and the woman was no bigger than her thumb and had long silver hair and pointed ears like from the old fairy tales. And her eyes were bright purple and glowing softly in the dim light of the ship, and next to her sat the smallest dragon Maya had ever seen, and it was no bigger than a bird, with scales that shimmered like pearls and tiny wings folded against its body. The small woman looked up at Maya with fear in her eyes and spoke in a voice that sounded like bells ringing, and she said, "Please do not let them find me, and I need your help." And before Maya could answer, the ship alarm started screaming and red lights flashed everywhere, and her crew member, Kelly, ran to her station and said, "Captain, we have 20 warships surrounding us, and they are demanding we give them a princess." And Maya looked back at her coffee mug and the tiny woman. The small woman stood up even though she was shaking and said, "I am Princess Aria of the Luminar Empire, and those ships belong to my people, but they are not here to save me, and they want to drag me back to marry someone I do not love and to fight in a war I cannot support." And the tiny dragon made a chirping sound and smoke came from its nose, and Maya had only seconds to decide what to do. Maya closed her hand gently around the princess and felt a tiny heartbeat racing against her palm, and she told Kelly to tell them we have not seen any princess and we are just a research ship. And Kelly looked worried and said, "Captain, they are charging their weapons and—" The princess spoke from inside Maya's hand and said, "They will destroy your ship and they will destroy 100 more ships because my mother the Empress does not accept anyone saying no to her." Through the window, Maya could see the enemy warships, and they were beautiful and terrible at the same time, and they glowed with light that human technology could not make. And every instinct told Maya this was a fight. Humanity could not win, but that had never stopped humans before, and Maya asked the princess, "Why are you running, and what is worth starting a war over?" Princess Aria stood in Maya's palm with her dragon on her shoulder, and she looked much older than her delicate face suggested, and she said, "My people are wrong, and we have conquered 17 different species and enslaved their worlds, and now we are preparing to do the same to Earth, and I have seen your planet, and I have watched humans, and your courage, and your refusal to give up even when you cannot win. And I will not be the weapon they use against you." The lead warship fired a warning shot that burned across the front of Maya's ship, and the shields turned white from the heat, and Maya made her choice and told Kelly to start evasive maneuvers and told navigation to plot a course into the asteroid field, and she said, "We are going to show these people what happens when they threaten a human ship." As the ship turned and flew away, Princess Aria held on to Maya's thumb, and her tiny dragon roared at the warships that were 10,000 times bigger than it was, and the war that would shake the galaxy had just begun because a captain refused to hand over a scared woman, no matter how small she was. And Maya looked at the princess and said, "Hold on, because this is going to be rough," and Aria smiled despite her fear and said, "I chose the right people to ask for help." The ship dove into the asteroid field, and rocks the size of mountains flew past them, and the enemy warships followed. But they were bigger and slower, and Maya knew every trick for flying through dangerous space, and she had her crew scatter false signals across hundreds of asteroids while their ship hid in the shadow of a giant rock, and Kelly was working on translating the enemy communications, and what she found made everyone go quiet. The Luminar were not just looking for their princess, and they were calling for more warships, and they had sent a message to their whole fleet with the location of Earth, and they were going to use this as an excuse to invade, and Princess Aria had been right, and they were always going to attack humanity, and she had just made it happen sooner. Maya felt anger burning in her chest, and she looked at the princess and said, "They were always going to do this." And Aria nodded and said, My mother has wanted Earth since your first radio signals reached our space, and she thinks humans are primitive and easy to conquer, but she is wrong, and you split atoms before you left your atmosphere, and you went to the moon with computers weaker than your phones, and you have survived diseases and wars and extinction events, and your own worst impulses, and you are terrifying in your ability to survive anything. Kelly asked, then help us. And you know their tactics and their technology and their weaknesses. And Princess Arya looked sad and said, I know something better, and I know where my mother keeps the codes that control every conquered world. And the 17 species we enslaved could be 17 allies if we can free them. And Maya felt hope rising and asked, how do we do that? And Arya said, I stole the access codes, but they only work with my DNA, and they can only be used from inside the Imperial Palace, which is on a space station the size of your moon with 3 million soldiers guarding it. The engineer. Sophie laughed, but it was not a happy sound, and she said, and you are 7 inches tall. And the dragon chirped angrily and spread its wings, and Arya said, actually, I am 7 inches. And Ember, my dragon can grow much larger in the right atmospheric conditions, and he would be big enough to swallow this ship. And everyone went silent, thinking about what that meant. Maya looked at her crew, and they were scientists and explorers who signed up to study stars, not fight wars, but they were also humans, and humans had never been good at accepting impossible odds. And she said, set course for Earth, and we need to warn them and find allies, and then we are going to sneak into an Imperial space station and free 17 enslaved worlds and probably start the biggest war this galaxy has ever seen. Princess Arya smiled, and it was fierce, and she said, now you understand why I chose you, and as the ship slipped out of the asteroid field heading toward Earth with an entire enemy fleet chasing them. None of them knew this desperate plan would be remembered for thousands of years, and the war that would make humanity famous among the stars had truly begun. It started with a princess, small enough to hide in a coffee cup, and humans too stubborn to let her face darkness alone. And Maya built a small habitat for Arya on her desk, using furniture that Sophie printed, and the dragon watched everyone with eyes that showed it understood far more than any Earth animal, and over the next 3 days, as they raced toward home, Arya taught them everything she knew about her people. She told them about weak points in their shields, and when their weapons needed to recharge, and how their command structure was too rigid and could be exploited, and she told them about the 17 conquered species, and how they were kept obedient through control systems in their power and water and food that could be shut down if they rebelled, but all those controls were commanded from the palace and could be turned off by someone with royal access. The trip to Earth felt both too long and too short, and when they finally arrived, Maya could see her home planet burning across every news channel, and not with fire, but with panic and fear because her warning message had reached the United Earth Coalition, and the planet was preparing for war with an enemy they had never met using technology they could not match. Admiral Patricia Cole met them at the orbital station, and her face was hard as stone, and she said, "You brought the devil to our door." Captain Brooks, but Maya replied the devil was already coming, and the princess just gave us a fighting chance. And Arya stepped forward in her clear habitat and pressed one tiny hand against the wall and said, "I have information your military needs," and over 6 hours she proved her worth. Arya transformed certain death into slim hope, and she showed them where human weapons could work, and when enemy defenses were weak, and how their command could be disrupted, but it was her plan to free the 17 species that changed everything, because if they could override the control codes, then 17 enslaved civilizations would be free to fight, and some had military power greater than Earth. Admiral Cole studied the princess, who was smaller than a coffee cup, and asked, "What do you want in return?" And Arya said, "Sanctuary and asylum on Earth and prosecution for my mother war crimes under whatever laws we make after this is over." And Cole was surprised and asked, "You do not want power, and you are royalty." And Arya laughed bitterly and said, "I watched my mother rule for 300 years, and I have seen what power does to those who want it. And no, I only wish to live quietly and study at one of your universities and raise Ember in peace." The fleet that gathered over the next 5 days was unlike anything humanity had ever built, and there were converted civilian owl ships covered with improvised weapons and military vessels pushed beyond their design limits, and volunteers came by the tens of thousands from every nation and every walk of life, united by something humanity had not felt in generations, which was a cause worth dying for. On the day the enemy vanguard arrived, Admiral Cole launched the first phase of Aria Plan, and 36 ships broke away from Earth defensive line and ran, but not in retreat, and they were leading the enemy on a chase toward the outer system, and the Luminar, who were bred for conquest and confident in their superiority, followed them without hesitation. They followed right into the trap, and humanity had been mining asteroids for decades to harvest rare metals, and now those mining charges were repurposed and remotely detonated, and they turned a section of space into a kill zone, and kinetic projectiles launched from hidden positions tore through shield-depleted hulls, and the Vanguard was destroyed completely. Humanity's first interstellar battle was a victory, but Admiral Cole stood on her bridge, watching debris scatter, and felt no happiness, and she said, "They will come at us with everything now, and no more testing and the full weight of their empire," and beside her command chair, Aria Habitat rested, and the princess watched the aftermath with grim understanding. Aria said yes, and now my mother will take this personally, and she will come with the core fleets and with world-breaker weapons that can destroy planets. And she met Cole's eyes and said, "Which means now is when we must strike." And while she is gathering forces for the killing blow, we slip one small ship through her lines and reach the palace. Maya said, "The Horizon Edge can do it, because we are a research vessel with minimal military signature and familiar to your people from the chase." And Admiral Cole nodded slowly and said, "You will need escorts, and you need to move fast because intelligence suggests the main enemy fleet will be here in 3 weeks, and you have to free those 17 species before then, or Earth falls," as Maya prepared to leave on what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission. Princess Aria asked for a moment alone with her, and in the quiet of Maya quarters, the princess stood in her habitat with Ember coiled protectively around her, and she asked simply, "Why and why risk so much for people you have never met, and the 17 worlds and my freedom do not matter as much as your survival?" Maya thought about the question and this tiny alien princess who had bet everything on humanity better nature. And she said finally, "Because someone told me that humans are terrifying in our resilience. And I think our resilience comes from this, which is we refuse to live in a universe where slavery and oppression are accepted, and we will fight impossible odds and make insane sacrifices and burn ourselves out completely before we will bow to tyrants." And she smiled and said, "Maybe that is stupid, and maybe it will get us killed, but it is who we are." Princess Aria touched the clear wall between them, and for a moment the gulf of size and species meant nothing, and she whispered, "Then I chose correctly. And no matter what comes, I am honored to have met you." The Horizon Edge left Earth with 23 volunteer ships, knowing most would likely die creating distractions, so the research vessel could slip through, and they jumped toward the galactic core and toward the heart of an empire that had never known defeat, carrying a princess the size of a doll and humanity. Desperate hope. The journey took 8 days, and one by one the escort ships sacrificed themselves, and they drew off patrols and created diversions and cleared paths through defense lines, and each loss hurt. But Kelly recorded their final messages, and they all said the same thing, which was go get them Horizon, and by the time they reached the Imperial Palace, only 6 escorts remained. The palace defied understanding, and it was not a building, or even a station in any normal sense, but an artificial moon made of crystal and metal that blazed with its own light, and thousands of ships swarmed around it, and there were pleasure craft for nobles and cargo vessels bringing tribute and warships that made Earth's entire fleet look like toys. Getting inside was going to be impossible, which was exactly what they planned to do, and Princess Arya explained the servant entrance, where supply ships docked every hour with no nobles and no high-ranking military and just cargo and people. The Empire did not see. Maya studied the approach and asked, "How do we get through security?" And Sophie said, "They will scan us and check records and probably have guards everywhere," and Arya's expression was complicated, and she said they will scan for weapons, yes, but not for life signs, because servants are too far beneath notice, and they will, however, notice a human ship, which is why you must hide and let me and Ember go in alone. Maya said absolutely not, but Arya insisted there is no choice, and a supply drone can be reprogrammed to carry me, and I have done it before sneaking around the palace as a child, and Ember and I can navigate service passages and reach the command center and broadcast the liberation codes, and you only need to wait for my signal. Then extract me." Nina, the tactical officer, said, "If something goes wrong, you will be caught inside a hostile palace, the size of a city being 7 inches tall with a dragon the size of a bird," and Arya said yes. "But if we fail, my mother will reach Earth in 2 weeks and end your species, and some risks must be taken." The argument went on for hours, but ultimately they all knew Arya was right, and the Horizon Edge could not dock without triggering alarms, but a tiny princess hiding in reprogrammed cargo might work. The preparation was careful, and Sophie built Ember a harness with a camera and communication relay that was primitive by enemy standards but undetectable by their scans. And Arya memorized routes through service tunnels that palace staff used and passages too small for nobility, and Kelly made a signal system so they could coordinate despite massive interference. On the morning of infiltration, as a stolen supply drone approached the docking bay, Maya held the tiny habitat one last time and said, "I wish we could do this for you." And Arya stood straight, dressed in servant clothes Sophie had made, and Ember perched on her shoulder looking far more serious than any creature his size should, and she said, "You are doing it for me, and everything you have risked, and everything Earth is fighting for is more than I deserve." And she met Maya's eyes and said, "If I do not come back, promise me you will keep fighting, because the codes are set to broadcast automatically if I reach the command center access panel, and even if I am captured, even if the worst happens, those 17 worlds will know they are free." Maya wanted to argue, to insist they would find another way, but she had been a ship captain long enough to know when someone was making peace with their fate, and she promised instead, "We will be waiting for you and try not to be late." The drone entered the palace docking bay without trouble, and it was one among hundreds of supply deliveries, and inside the cargo section, Arya and Ember huddled in darkness as automated systems unloaded containers around them, and then a maintenance robot opened their container to scan for damage. She and Ember slipped out through a gap in the scanner and entered a world Arya had once called home, and now saw with new eyes. The service passages were everything she promised, and they were cramped corridors where servants moved with heads down, too tired from 12-hour shifts to notice a 7-inch princess, and Tiny Dragon and Arya followed routes she memorized from childhood, climbing through ventilation systems and riding maintenance drones deeper into the palace heart. Through her camera feed, Maya and the crew watched in breathless tension, and the palace interior was beautiful in a cold, magnificent way, with all crystal and light and architecture that seemed to defy physics. But they also saw servants from dozens of species, all working under watchful eyes of overseers, who carried weapons casually. Arya's voice whispered through communication and said bitterly, "These are the civilized. We brought enlightenment to, and slaves with kinder names." 3 hours into infiltration, disaster struck, and a passage Arya remembered as open had been sealed for repairs and rerouting. Would add hours they did not have because the Horizon Edge was hiding in debris from an old battlefield, and even that camouflage would not last forever. Arya said, "There is another way through the noble quarters, but we will be exposed and visible, and if any royal family sees me..." And she trailed off, and Maya asked, "Can you do it?" And Arya looked at Ember. And the dragon chirped once, decisively, and she said, "We are not turning back now." The noble quarters were another universe entirely, and where service passages were cramped and dim, these corridors soared with crystal pillars and floors that gleamed like mirrors, and Arya and Ember moved from shadow to shadow, and the princess size was finally an advantage as she darted behind decorative sculptures and under furniture that had not been moved in centuries. They almost made it, and then a voice froze, Arya mid-step, and it said, "Well, well." Little sister and mother said, "You died heroically fighting the human barbarians." Prince Caden stood in the corridor, resplendent in ceremonial armor with 2 royal guards flanking him, and he was Arya, older brother, and first in line for the throne, and the cruelty in his smile made Maya blood run cold. Even through the camera feed, Arya said, "I wanted no part in this war," and stood her ground, despite being a fraction of her brother's size. Caden gestured and said, "And yet you started one anyway. And the humans you have championed are about to be crushed, and Mother Fleet will reach Earth in 14 days, and you, dear sister, will watch from a cell as we reduce their planet to ash." Ember roared, and it was impossibly loud for his small frame, and smoke billowed from his nostrils. Caden laughed and said, "Your pet dragon? And how quaint, and what can it do at that size and singe my boots?" What happened next was recorded by Arya camera and became one of the most famous moments in the war, and Ember, despite being no larger than a bird, launched himself at the prince with full fury of his species, and dragons were energy beings who took physical form, and size was optional, but mass was not. The impact sent Caden stumbling backward, and his armor dented where Ember struck, and the dragon might be small, but he hit like a battering ram. In the chaos, Arya ran, and she ran through corridors that blurred past her camera, and guards shouted behind her, and her brother furious bellows echoed through the palace, and Ember caught up diving and weaving to keep himself between Arya and pursuit. Arya gasped the command center and 2 corridors left, then 1 right, and Kelly confirmed, "We see it," and 30 seconds to access panel 20 seconds and 10. And Arya burst into a small maintenance room where an access panel glowed with script, and her hands flew across it, inputting codes Sophie had helped her prepare, and the liberation protocols were centuries of oppression about to be undone with a touch. The door exploded inward, and Caden stood there with armor scorched and rage making him glow, and he said, "You dare!" Arya said, "I dare everything," and pressed the final sequence. Across 17 worlds in 17 different languages, the message broadcast and control nodes deactivated and override protocols suspended, and for the first time in centuries, conquered civilizations found their infrastructure and weapons and freedom suddenly restored. The Empire's greatest nightmare had just come true, and 17 species, all with scores to settle, all suddenly unchained. Caden whispered, "You have killed us all." Arya replied, "No, and I have given everyone the chance to live free. And what they do with it is their choice." Maya's voice crackled through communication and said, "Arya, get to extraction point, and we are coming in hot." What followed was the most daring rescue in human history, and the Horizon Edge raced through the palace defensive perimeter, dodging fire from a dozen warships, while Arya and Ember fled through collapsing corridors as the palace descended into chaos, and freed servants were rising up and fighting back against overseers, and explosions rocked the structure as sabotaged systems failed. Arya reached the docking bay just as Horizon Edge crashed through external doors with shields screaming, and Maya was there at the airlock with hand extended, and Arya leapt with Ember on her shoulder, and it was a 7-inch jump that crossed the gulf between species and between worlds, and between the empire of the past and whatever future they were building together. The ship wheeled away as palace weapons came online, and as Caden's voice shrieked orders, and as the entire Imperial system began its long collapse, and behind them 17 worlds erupted in revolution, and ahead of them Earth waited, and the final battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The journey back to Earth took 6 days, and during that time the galaxy transformed, and the 17 liberated species began reclaiming their freedom, and some struck immediately at nearby enemy outposts, and others focused on rebuilding what had been destroyed, and all of them received Arya's second message, which was a call to come to Earth and stand with the humans who had risked everything to free them. The responses came one by one, and the Kethrans said, "We are coming," and the Vorn said, "We stand with humanity," and the Solari said, "We remember our slavery, and we will fight," and species after species pledged ships and soldiers and technology to the defense of Earth. But the main enemy fleet was also coming, and Empress Celestia herself commanded it, and she was ancient and powerful and burning with rage over her daughter's betrayal, and she broadcast on all frequencies, and her voice was cold as the void, and she said, "Humans of Earth, you have harbored a traitor and freed my rightful subjects and dared to defy natural order and surrender now, and I will make your extinction painless." On Fleet Station, Alpha Admiral Cole watched 3,000 enemy warships arrive, and they blotted out stars, and at their head flying, the Empress' personal banner was the flagship Dominion, and it was so massive it had its own gravity and bristled with weapons that could crack planets. Cole looked at the overwhelming force and felt a strange calm, and humanity had 47 operational warships cobbled together from military vessels and armed civilian craft. And by every calculation, this was suicide, Kelly observed from her station on Horizon Edge Bridge, and said they outnumber us 70-1. Maya replied, "Poor things do not stand a chance," and there was something fierce in her smile, because they were not alone, and the 17 liberated species had come, and space rippled with new arrivals, and Kethran battle pods, sleek and deadly, and Vorn juggernauts, massive ships bristling with kinetic cannons, and Solari stealth frigates that seemed to phase in and out of reality, and ship after ship and fleet after fleet, bringing together technologies from 17 different military traditions, all unified by a simple principle, which was never again. The Kethran ambassador message was brief and said the humans freed us and we stand with them. The Vorn admiral was even shorter and said, "Let us end these imperial oppressors." Empress Celestia's shock was clear even across the void, and she expected terror from Earth, and instead she faced the largest coalition fleet ever assembled, united against her by the species she believed broken. The Battle of Earth began with the enemy attempting their standard overwhelming assault. Confident that superior technology and numbers would carry the day, but they had never fought an enemy that learned and adapted and shared information freely and treated every species as equals rather than tools. They had never fought humans. The coalition did not meet them head-on, and instead, following tactics, Arya helped devise, they fought in coordinated strike groups, and Kethran pods would disable shields with exotic energy weapons, and Vorn juggernauts would follow with kinetic attacks that ripped through hulls, and human vessels faster and more maneuverable would dart in to finish crippled ships before retreating behind Solari stealth screens. It was chaos and improvisation, and it was beautiful. On Horizon Edge Bridge, Arya stood in her habitat with Ember beside her and watched her mother empire burn, and she said she is holding back her world breakers and the planet killer weapons, and she still believes she can win with conventional force. Maya asked quietly. Kenshi Arya expression was grim and said, "If this becomes a battle of attrition, yes, and our coalition is fighting with courage and unity, but the enemy has been building this fleet for 3 centuries, and eventually they will grind us down," which meant they needed to end this quickly. Admiral Cole came to the same conclusion and transmitted to coalition commanders saying, "We need to cut off the head and take out the Dominion, and if we eliminate Celestia, the whole empire collapses into succession wars." The Vorn admiral replied, "It is surrounded by the heaviest concentration of their fleet, and we would never break through." Maya said, Then we do not break through, and an idea was forming, and she looked at Arya and said, "Your mother knows you are here, and she is furious, and what if we gave her what she wants?" Arya understood immediately and set a meeting and pretend to negotiate my return in exchange for Earth survival, and she will agree believing it is her victory, Nina added from tactical, and when she does, we will have her exactly where we want her. The plan was insane, and it relied on Celestia arrogance and on her certainty that even in the middle of a massive fleet battle, no one would dare harm an empress, but insanity had gotten them this far. The message was sent, and to everyone's shock, Celestia agreed, and she would meet with Captain Maya Brooks and the traitorous Princess Arya aboard the Dominion under flag of truce to discuss terms, and Maya would come alone and unarmed bringing Arya. Sophie said bluntly, "She is going to kill you," as Maya prepared to leave. Maya agreed probably, and that is why you are going to follow at exactly 3 minutes behind, coming in through the same route we used at the palace, and Arya, you are giving them the full tour. The shuttle that carried Maya to Dominion was small and fragile-looking and surrounded by an honor guard of warships that could vaporize it without effort, and Maya wore her dress uniform and carried Arya habitat, and the princess and dragon were visible through transparent walls. The Dominion interior made the palace look humble, and everything was gold and crystal and soaring spaces that echoed with power, and at the center of the throne room sat Empress Celestia. She was beautiful in the way a star is beautiful and ancient and burning and utterly inhuman in her grandeur. And when she spoke, her voice resonated with centuries of absolute authority, and she said so. The primitive who corrupted my daughter Maya replied, "I did not corrupt anyone," and Arya chose her own path. Celestia dismissed this saying, "Arya is a child, and 300 years old and barely an adult by our standards, and she does not understand the burden of empire and the necessity of order and the natural hierarchy of species," and her gaze focused on the habitat, and she said, "Come out, daughter, and it is time to return home." Arya emerged, standing on Maya palm, with Ember on her shoulder, and said, "I am not coming back, and I am staying with Earth." Celestia said that was not a request, and her hand moved, and suddenly Arya was floating lifted by invisible force directly to the Empress throne, and Maya lunged forward, but guards appeared holding her back. Celestia continued, "You think I do not know what you planned, and a fool's attempt to kill me and decapitate the Empire, and I have survived 47 assassination attempts, and crushed 62 rebellions, and conquered 17 species, and what made you think humans would be any different?" Arya said this and pressed a button on the small device Sophie had hidden in Ember harness. The signal went out, and Horizon Edge, which had been hiding in Dominion-owned shadow, using Solari stealth technology, emerged at point-blank range, and at the same instant every freed servant aboard the massive vessel and slaves who had spent years maintaining ship systems struck simultaneously, and power conduits exploded and shield generators failed, and Sophie, who had been hiding in maintenance tunnels for 3 minutes with a team of commandos, seized control of environmental systems. The throne room depressurized, and guards were sucked into space, and Celestia, protected by personal shields, held on, but her attention was divided, and her grip on Arya weakened. That was when Ember grew. Dragons could compress or expand their mass at will in proper atmospheric conditions, and the instant Sophie adjusted Dominion environment to match standard Ember, exploded in size, and in seconds he went from hummingbird to eagle to something that filled half the throne room, and he was a dragon in truth, with scales gleaming like stars and wings that generated their own wind and fury that had been compressed for far too long. He roared, and it was the sound of empire ending. Celestia released Arya in shock, and Maya, in her armored suit, caught the princess as Ember attacked the Empress, and the battle between them shook the ship, and it was ancient power against ancient power, and a mother authority against a daughter defiance made manifest. Sophie's voice came through communication saying, "We need to go, and this whole ship is coming apart." They ran, and Maya carrying Arya and Ember. holding off Celestia and racing through corridors that buckled and twisted, and Dominion was dying, brought down by sabotage and revolution, and the symbolic heart of Empire collapsing into fire. Horizon Edge waited at the docking bay, already pulling away as they leaped the gap, and behind them, Ember finally disengaged, growing wings wide enough to carry him through the void as Dominion exploded, and it was a star of destruction that lit the battlefield. Celestia survived because, ancient and powerful as she was, she could survive even that. But her flagship was gone, and her authority shattered, and as coalition forces pressed the attack, the enemy fleet began to fragment, and some ships fought on, and others retreated, and still others, crewed by servants from conquered species, turned their weapons on their masters. The battle raged for 3 more hours, but the outcome was never in doubt after that, and the empire that had conquered 17 species broke against Earth and the alliance forged from those it had enslaved. 3 days later, as treaty negotiations began, and the galaxy tried to understand this new order, Maya found Aria in her habitat, which was now expanded into a full apartment using technology, though still small by human standards. Maya observed you could be bigger now, and Ember proved that size is a choice for your species. Aria agreed I could, but I have spent weeks at this size, and I have learned something, and when you are small, people do not see you as a threat, and they underestimate you, and there is a special kind of power in being underestimated. And she smiled. And besides, I have grown rather fond of riding in your pocket, Ember, who now alternated between bird size and ship size. Depending on his mood, chirped agreement Earth had survived, and the 17 liberated species were forging new futures, and the Empire was fractured with its successor states fighting over remnants, and at the center of it all was an unlikely alliance, which was a human captain and a tiny alien princess, and a dragon who learned that sometimes the smallest person could change everything. Maya asked what now Aria looked out at the stars and at a galaxy suddenly full of possibility instead of domination, and said, now we make sure this never happens again, and we build something better than empire, and we create a coalition based on choice and on mutual defense and on respect for every species. Sovereignty, Maya observed, that sounds like a lot of work. Aria replied, good thing humans are terrifying in their resilience, and echoed her own words from what felt like a lifetime ago. The Horizon Edge resumed its original mission, which was exploration and research and the endless human drive to discover what lay beyond the next star. But now they traveled with an alien princess hidden in the captain quarters and a dragon that could grow to swallow ships, and the knowledge that they had helped start something unprecedented. The weeks after the battle were filled with diplomacy and negotiations, and representatives from all 17 liberated species came to Earth to discuss the formation of a new coalition, and one that would be based on equality and mutual respect rather than conquest and domination. Princess Aria attended every meeting, and though she was small enough to fit in a coffee cup, her voice carried weight because she had been the catalyst for freedom, and the one who had risked everything to break her own empire and species. After species stood to thank her and to pledge their support for the new order. The former servants from Dominion had stories to tell, and they spoke of years spent in bondage and of watching their homes conquered and their families separated, and of the hope they felt when Aria broadcast the liberation codes, and many of them asked to meet the tiny princess in person. Maya watched as Aria sat in her habitat receiving visitors, and the princess listened to each story with compassion, and sometimes tears ran down her face, and she apologized over and over for what her people had done, and each time the visitors said, "You are not responsible for their crimes, and you chose to stand against them." And that takes more courage than we can express. Ember had become something of a legend among the coalition forces, and the dragon who could change size at will was both adorable as a bird and terrifying as a ship-sized beast, and children from a dozen species drew pictures of him and left them outside Aria quarters, and the princess kept every single one. But not everyone was happy with the new arrangement, and there were factions within the former empire who wanted to restore the old ways and who saw Arya as a traitor deserving death, and assassination attempts came regularly, and each time coalition security stopped them. But it was clear the princess would never be truly safe. Maya found Arya one evening staring out at the stars from her small apartment and asked if she regretted her choice. Arya was quiet for a long moment, and then said, "I regret the pain my actions caused and the lives lost in the war and the families torn apart, but I do not regret choosing freedom over tyranny, and I would make the same choice again." Maya sat down so her eyes were level with Arya Habitat and said, "You know you do not have to keep attending these meetings and putting yourself in danger, and you have done enough." Arya smiled sadly and said, "I have to see this through, and these species trusted me to help build something better, and I cannot abandon them now. And besides, where would I go? And Earth is my home now, but the work is not finished." The coalition that formed over the following months was unlike anything the galaxy had seen, and it was not an empire or a federation in the traditional sense, but a voluntary alliance where each species maintained sovereignty and contributed what they could, and decisions were made by consensus rather than decree. Earth took a leading role, not because humans demanded it, but because the other species insisted, and they remembered that humanity had been willing to fight impossible odds to free strangers, and that Maya had protected a 7-inch princess when it would have been easier to hand her over. Admiral Cole became the first Supreme Commander of the Coalition Defense Force, and her first act was to establish protocols ensuring no species would ever be enslaved again, and fleets were positioned to protect the most vulnerable worlds, and rapid response teams trained to intervene in conflicts before they escalated. Princess Arya was offered a formal position as Ambassador of Reconciliation, and her role was to help heal the wounds left by centuries of imperial rule. And she traveled from world to world, meeting with survivors and helping establish truth and reconciliation commissions. Maya remained captain of Horizon Edge, but now her mission included ferrying Arya to different planets and providing security during her visits, and the research vessel became known throughout the galaxy as the ship that started the revolution. Sophie continued as chief engineer and developed technology that allowed different species to work together more easily, and translation devices and environmental controls and shared databases, and her innovations became standard across the coalition. Kelly took on the role of communications director and established networks that connected all member species and ensured information flowed freely and transparently. And she made sure every world had a voice in coalition decisions. Nina became head of coalition tactical training and taught the defensive strategies that had won the Battle of Earth to security forces across the galaxy, and her methods emphasized protection over aggression and deterrence over conquest. The remnants of the Luminar Empire continued to fracture, and Empress Celestia disappeared after the Battle of Earth, and some said she died, and others claimed she fled to the far reaches of the galaxy, and Prince Caden attempted to rally loyalists, but found few willing to follow him, and eventually he too vanished into obscurity. But there were still those who clung to the old ways, and pirates and warlords who tried to exploit the chaos of transition, and the coalition faced constant challenges as it worked to bring stability to regions that had known only oppression for generations. On the 1-year anniversary of the Battle of Earth, a memorial was unveiled at Fleet Station Alpha, and it bore the names of every being who had died fighting for freedom, both from Earth forces and from the 17 species, and at the center was a statue showing a human hand extended palm up with a tiny figure standing on it. The figure was Princess Arya, and the sculptor had captured her expression perfectly, which was fierce and determined and hopeful. And beside her stood ember wings spread, and the statue was titled The Choice. Arya stood before it in her habitat, transported by Maya, and she was crying and said, "I do not deserve this, and so many died because of my choices." An elderly Kethran veteran approached and knelt before her habitat, and said, "You deserve this and more. And my grandchildren are free because of you, and that is worth any price." Similar sentiments echoed from representatives of all 17 species, and they had brought gifts and tokens of appreciation and stories of how their worlds were healing and rebuilding. That evening, Maya and Arya sat together in the captain quarters aboard Horizon Edge and watched stars drift past the viewport, and the princess said, "Do you think we succeeded? And is this new coalition really better than what came before?" Maya considered the question carefully and said, "I think we are trying to be better, and we have systems in place to prevent the abuses of the old empire, and we have accountability and transparency, and most importantly, we have people like you who refuse to let us slip back into old patterns." And she smiled and added, "But it is a work in progress, and it will always be a work in progress, because freedom requires constant vigilance." Arya nodded and said, "That is a very human perspective, and always striving and never satisfied, and always believing you can improve." Maya laughed and said, "Guilty as charged. And we are an annoying species that way." Ember chirped from his perch, and both women looked at him, and the dragon had grown to cat size for the evening, and he looked content and happy, and very different from the terrified creature hiding in a coffee cup 1 year ago. The months turned into years, and the coalition grew stronger, and new species applied for membership, and old wounds slowly healed. And Princess Arya continued her work, traveling tirelessly and speaking truth to power and ensuring that the voices of the formerly enslaved were never forgotten. Maya and her crew explored distant stars and made first contact with civilizations beyond coalition space, and every time they met someone new, they told the story of a tiny princess and a dragon and how the smallest person had changed the galaxy. Children across coalition worlds learned about the revolution in school, and they studied the tactics of the Battle of Earth and the courage of the 17 species who rose up, and the human principle of standing up for others even at great cost. Princess Arya wrote a memoir called The View from Small Places, and it became required reading for coalition diplomats. And in it she described her journey from privileged royalty to revolutionary, and her growing understanding that true power came not from domination, but from service. The book's final chapter was titled, "What I Learned from Humans," and in it, she wrote that humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy was not their technology or their military tactics, but their stubborn refusal to accept injustice, and their bone-deep belief that every being deserved dignity and freedom regardless of size or species or bot origin. 10 years after the Battle of Earth, Princess Arya announced she was retiring from public life, and she had done what she set out to do, which was help build a coalition based on justice and ensure the Empire crimes were acknowledged and begin the long process of healing. She chose to remain on Earth and accepted a teaching position at the university, where she gave lectures on ethics and governance and interspecies relations, and students from across the galaxy came to study with the princess who had toppled an empire. Maya retired from active service around the same time and bought a small house near the university, and Arya moved into an apartment built into one of the rooms, and they remained close friends and collaborators working together on various projects and initiatives. Ember grew to full dragon size when he wanted and spent his days flying over Earth oceans and forests, and he became something of a local celebrity, and children would gather to watch him soar overhead, and he seemed to enjoy the attention. The Horizon Edge was retired and placed in a museum, and visitors could walk through the ship that had started a revolution and see the small desk where Princess Arya had first planned the liberation codes and the bridge where Kelly had coordinated the Battle of Earth. On quiet evenings, Maya and Arya would sit together and remember, and they talked about the people they had lost, and the sacrifices that had been made, and the future they were still building. Arya would sometimes say, "I still cannot believe you did all that for me when I was a stranger and an enemy." And so very small, Maya would always reply the same way, which was, "You were never small where it mattered, and you had the biggest heart of anyone I ever met. And besides, what kind of person would I be if I had handed you over?" The galaxy had changed, and species that had been enslaved for centuries were now free and building their own futures, and the coalition continued to grow and evolve and face new challenges. But at the heart of it all was a simple truth that humanity had known for generations, which was that standing up for others, even at great personal cost, was not just the right thing to do, but the only thing worth doing. The tiny alien princess who had hidden beside a human captain had done more than save herself, and she had helped save 17 species, and broken an empire, and forged the foundation for a galaxy where beings could live free. Her guards had stood speechless that first day, when she chose to trust a human, and in the years that followed, the entire galaxy stood in awe of what that choice had created. It was the most human thing anyone had ever done, which was to see someone who needed help and say, "Not on my watch," and that simple act of compassion had changed everything. While enemy ships were 6 days away, and every nation and every voice that wanted to be heard debated whether to trust an alien princess or face extinction alone, and the arguments were passionate about trust and risk, and the morality of freeing slaves by starting a war that could kill billions. Maya watched from an observation deck with Aria Habitat beside her, and the princess whispered, "I am sorry, and I thought I was helping. But I have brought only terror and division." And Maya said, "You brought us a choice, and humanity has always been best when choosing to stand up for someone other than ourselves." And she smiled and said, "Besides, we are good at this. And we once fought what we called the Good War because we united against genuine evil, and your empire enslaving innocent civilizations is as clear as evil gets." The vote passed with 67% in favor, and Earth would fight, and they would fight for all 17 enslaved species.